This week, the government is gearing up to drop some new data, and the big headline is going to be that inflation has finally slowed down. Sounds like fantastic news, right? But hold on a second. Before we pop the champagne, we really need to dig into why this upcoming announcement is actually kind of a smokescreen for a much harsher reality hitting your wallet.
So, the expected June Consumer Price Index, or CPI, headline is sitting at 3.8%. And yeah, that's down from May's 4.2%, which, let's be honest, was a pretty massive jump. But you really need to take this new 3.8% figure with a gigantic grain of salt. Why? Because the economic pressure building underneath it hasn't gone anywhere.
You're going to see this headline everywhere. Inflation is cooling down. But the reality on the ground? We're all already paying roughly a third more for goods and services than we were before the pandemic. That's a huge hit. So in this explainer, I'm going to show you what's actually still driving these prices up behind the scenes. And then I'll walk you through 5 concrete steps you can take today to protect your money, while everyone else is just getting fooled by a neat little number on a screen.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Unmasking the Hidden Drivers. Okay, so almost all of that recent drop from May's 4.2%, it's coming from temporary stuff, namely falling gas and oil prices after a recent Middle East ceasefire. Now, sure, that gives us some immediate relief at the pump, which is great, but that temporary dip is perfectly masking what's happening literally everywhere else in the economy. If you strip out those super volatile food and energy costs, you get what economists call core inflation. And core inflation has actually climbed every single month this year, sitting just under 3% in May. Basically, the underlying price of almost everything else in your life is still steadily marching up.
A huge reason this core inflation is so stubborn, so sticky, comes down to trade policy. The effective tariff rate has absolutely skyrocketed from 2.1% last year to roughly 11.7% right now. These are very real, very substantial costs that businesses have already had to absorb over the last 12 months.
And the really crucial point here is that businesses aren't just eating those costs out of the goodness of their hearts. Actually, the data shows that more than half of those ballooning tariff costs are getting passed straight through to you at the checkout line. It is literally a direct pipeline from international trade policy right into your daily budget.
Which brings us to Section 2, the surprising AI buildout penalty.
On top of those trade policies, we're seeing this totally unprecedented pressure on prices. It's a massive, highly unusual driver of inflation right now that almost nobody in the mainstream financial press is even talking about. And it all revolves around the race to build artificial intelligence. Tech companies are currently projected to spend more money next year building out AI infrastructure, so data centers, servers, specialized chips, than the United States spends on its entire military force. Seriously, let that sink in for a second. That is an absolute avalanche of capital flooding into one specific sector of the economy.
And here's the kicker. All those massive new AI data centers require an unbelievable amount of power to run and stay cool. The sheer energy required by this build-out has already pushed electricity prices up almost 6% over the past year alone. So, next time you open your utility bill and wonder why it's so high, well, a piece of that is quite literally fueling the AI boom.
And it doesn't stop there. This boom is just hoarding physical resources. The massive demand is pushing memory and storage chip prices so high that regular consumer tech is getting noticeably more expensive. Companies like Apple have already been forced to hike prices on iPads and Macs strictly because of these supply chain pressures. Economists point out that every 10% rise in AI hardware costs trickles right down, adding about 0.1% to broader consumer inflation.
That leads us right into Section 3, the quiet job market squeeze.
This persistent, sticky inflation hurts even more right now because of the weird environment workers are stuck in. You might look around and think, hey, things seem relatively stable. But the current job market is trapped in what economists call a low-hire, low-fire pattern. What does that mean? Well, people aren't necessarily losing their jobs in massive waves, which is why we aren't seeing widespread panic. But hiring is sitting near multi-decade lows. Job postings have been completely flat for 6 straight months. And the most painful part, real wage growth, meaning your wages adjusted for inflation has actually turned negative. You are quietly, slowly losing ground against the cost of living, even if you still have your job.
And here is the really uncomfortable truth that totally gets lost in all that optimistic reporting. Inflation doesn't have to violently spike to hurt you. It just has to stay elevated for years while your income doesn't keep pace. A cool down from 4.2% to 3.8%, that doesn't mean prices are actually dropping. It just means your bills are still getting more expensive, just a tiny bit slower than they were last month.
So let's talk solutions in our final section, navigating the new normal.
What do we actually do about all this? The people who come out ahead in an economic environment like this aren't the ones just crossing their fingers waiting for prices to magically drop back to 2019 levels. No way. They're the ones adjusting their strategy right now. They're assuming that these elevated prices are the new normal, not just a temporary detour. So let's look at 5 concrete steps you can take today to protect your wallet against these hidden economic pressures. Step 1. Stop budgeting off last year's prices. Seriously, if your monthly grocery or gas budget is still based on what you remember things costing a year or 2 ago, you are guaranteed to overspend every single month. You've got to sit down and completely rebuild your spending plan using today's actual checkout costs. Moving on to step 2, and this one is absolutely crucial. Prioritize paying down variable rate debt right now. Look, with the Federal Reserve holding rates steady at 3.5 to 3.75% and inflation remaining so sticky due to those tariffs and the huge AI buildout, any debt you have tied to variable rates isn't likely to get significantly cheaper anytime soon. Attacking this debt aggressively is one of the absolute safest financial moves you can make today.
All right, step 3. You need to mentally treat any pay raise you get as inflation catch-up, not extra discretionary income. If your raise this year is smaller than the actual price increases you're seeing out there, you basically got a pay cut in real terms. Do not, I repeat, do not let a slightly bigger number on your paycheck trick you into loosening up your spending habits.
Step 4 requires a little bit of strategic shopping. Watch tariff-exposed categories carefully. We're talking about electronics, appliances, and broadly, really anything that's heavily imported. If you know you're going to need to make a big purchase in one of these categories, remember that the tariff pass-through pressure we just talked about is way more likely to grow than it is to shrink in the next few months.
And finally, step 5. Build your emergency fund assuming prices keep climbing. The old standard rule of thumb, saving 3 to 6 months of expenses, well, that was calculated using old prices. You really need to recheck what 3 months of your actual current elevated expenses cost today. It is almost certainly a higher target than you originally set.
Ultimately, those mainstream cooling headlines you're going to see all over the news this week won't mention that tariffs, massive AI infrastructure spending, and sticky core prices are sticking around for the long haul. So ignore the noise. Base your financial plan on reality. Plan your money around what is actually happening inside your physical grocery cart, not what a headline claims is happening on paper.
I really want to hear from you on this. Have you noticed prices still climbing in your day-to-day life, despite all these quote-unquote good news economic headlines? Drop a comment below and let us know what you're actually seeing at the register. Because cutting through the spin and validating your lived experience with hard data, that is exactly what this explainer is all about. Thanks for tuning in, and stay focused out there.